Ash-Shafi'i, the famous Islamic jurist, was reported as having said, لقد اطلعت من أهل الكلام على شيء ما ظننت مسلما يقوله, that I have found from the people of Kalam or speculative theology things which I do not assume, which I do not fathom that a Muslim could possibly say it. It is also famously reported and attributed to Ash-Shafi'i that for a servant to meet God Almighty with every sin other than shirk, other than polytheism, is better for him than that he meets his Lord with something from the knowledge of rational or speculative theology. This shows that the Salaf, as is traditionally called by Islamic scholarship, the pious early generations, they adopted a negative view towards kalam and rational or speculative theology. And hence many Salafis or Atharis, or those who attempt to follow these early generations of Muslims, they argue that the use of this rational speculative theology is incorrect and goes against Islamic teachings. However, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis and those who engage in rational theology, whilst also having respect for the early generations in the Islamic tradition, argue that this prohibition, or that these comments against rational or speculative theology, they are within the context of that rational theology which goes against the Quran and the Sunnah, the Islamic texts, and what they teach. And also, what is important to consider is the historical context in which these statements are being made. Because during the period of the pious predecessors, as the Muslims would call them so, the kind of rational and speculative theology that was very prevalent was that of supposedly deviant or heterodox groups, such as the Mu'tazila or the Jahmiyyah. Hence, the pious predecessors used to give general judgments based on the fact that the generality of kalam, of theology in their times, of rational theology in their times, was based upon innovation or deviance. However, Ash'aris and Maturidis would argue that since they are following the traditional orthodox Sunni methodology and they are simply using these rational tools to defend that orthodox theology and faith, therefore these statements cannot apply to them. Hence, it's a constant back and forth between Atharis and Salafis and Ash'aris and Maturidis about whether or not these statements apply to the kalam or the rational speculative theology of the Ash'aris and Maturidis, or whether they don't apply to them. As-Suyuti, the famous polymath of the Muslim world, said, indeed, the knowledges, the various sciences and disciplines of falsafa, of philosophy, are prohibited, كالمنطق لإجماع السلف, like logic, for the consensus of the Salaf, of the pious predecessors. وأكثر المفسرين المعتبرين من الخلف, and most of the relied upon exegetes of the Khalaf. وممن صلح بذلك ابن الصلاح والنووي, and from those who made clear with that, made this clear, were Ibn al-Salah and al-Nawawi, two very famous Islamic scholars. Then he mentions As-Suyuti, Al-Qari quoting from As-Suyuti mentions that As-Suyuti says that وذكر الحافظ سراج الدين القزويني, that Al-Hafiz, the memorizer, the lamp of the religion, Al-Qazwini, from the Hanafis, في كتاب ألفه في تحريمه, in a book that he authored in the prohibition, meaning in prohibition of studying philosophy, أن الغزالي رجع إلى تحريمه بعد ثنائه عليه في أول المنطقة, that Al-Ghazali returned back to its prohibition after praising it first in Al-Muntaqa. This issue of whether Muslims engaged in rational theology and philosophy and whether they studied or not is very nuanced. It's important to note that within the early Islamic period, the Muslims were very much engaged in Greek philosophy and the Greek philosophical tradition, and in the various philosophical traditions of various civilizations, by the way, not just the Greeks. This included the Hindus, the Chinese, and the Persians, but most importantly, in the Muslim context, the Greco Roman tradition influenced the Muslims very heavily. Many early Muslim thinkers, polymaths, and scientists studied Greek philosophy quite heavily. For example, take the likes of Abu al-Barakat al-Baghdadi, the famous early Islamic physician who went on to influence Ibn Taymiyyah quite heavily. And the Islamic philosophical tradition, represented by the likes of Ibn Sina, Al-Kindi, Ibn Rushd, etc., are very well known. Those figures are very well known, and that Islamic philosophical tradition is very well known. The Ash'aris and the Maturidis, they took a very nuanced approach, and they, whilst acknowledging the negatives of philosophy and of rational theology, at least according to what their faith and what traditional Sunni Orthodox scholarship would indicate towards them, they still accepted the usage of rational theology because of the necessity of using it as a tool to defend religious faith and religious belief. And Al-Ghazali is an interesting case because although he does in fact criticize the use of philosophy and he does indeed refute the philosophers, he does also use philosophy very extensively. And in reality, Al-Ghazali is one of the most famous and brilliant rational thinkers and philosophers of the Islamic world. The common Orientalist trope that Al-Ghazali somehow stopped science or somehow got rid of science from the Muslim world is just, it's kind of ridiculous, considering the fact that Al-Ghazali himself was very rational in his approach. And even in the works where Al-Ghazali is refuting Greek philosophers and those influenced by Greek philosophy and refuting the Islamic philosophical tradition, for example in his Tahafutul Falasifa, he is primarily and fundamentally relying in those works as well upon philosophy to refute the philosophers. In fact, in some of his other works, he defends the use of, first of all, explaining the arguments and the philosophy of the opposition and steel manning their arguments and then attacking and destroying what the opponent says one by one. And he makes a very obvious point to his detractors who said that why is he talking and steel manning the arguments of his opponents and thereby exposing the beliefs of those groups to the masses. And he said that, well, look, if I don't academically and honestly respond to those arguments, then the opposition groups will make the very easy claim that I misunderstood the ideas or that I haven't fully grasped the complexity of the ideas, and hence they could just hand wave away my arguments against them. So first of all, I steel man their position, I fully explain their position, and then I refute them. However, it is important to note that at the same time, whilst they did have a complicated relationship with philosophy, and it wasn't as if they just completely rejected philosophy, they weren't entirely supportive of it either. And without a doubt, it is true that the Muslims had quite a heavy reaction, a very heavy conservative reaction, that is, to the state of the Muslim world within around the time of 1000 AD. Around the time of 1000 AD, the Muslim world was experiencing quite a lot of liberalization and decadence and secularization. And Muslims were very heavily influenced by these philosophies, and Al-Ghazali and his likes fundamentally crushed these philosophical traditions. Now, of course, the very obvious advantage of this was that it reinforced the Islamic traditional Islamic faith, and that gave the Muslims a strong sense of identity. However, the very obvious negative that many academics have pointed out is that this may have led to stagnation within the Muslim world post-Ghazali. And there is, of course, elements of truth to what each side says. There are elements of truth to what each side says. And it's very simple to understand and point out the fact that there was a general trend post Al-Ghazali towards the declining importance of scientific knowledge and trying to understand and learn science within the Muslim world. And although many Muslim apologists, and quite rightfully so, would argue that this decline wasn't in absolute terms, and it's not the case that Muslims completely gave up on science post Al-Ghazali. The truth is that the Muslim world never recovered the levels of scientific inquiry and just simple brilliance in the scientific disciplines as they had during the supposed golden age of Islam, or at least what Orientalists will label the golden age of Islam. Then came along the Mongol sacking of 1260, and the Muslim world never truly recovered from that. It was a truly traumatizing event for the Muslims, and the Muslims, as a reaction to the Mongol invasions, had an even more stronger conservative reaction. Starting around 1000 AD, a lot of the major Asian civilizations went through periods of fossilization, and hence the Muslim social order became stagnant and by the 1800s and the 1900s quite decadent, quite frankly, and they could no longer keep up with the Western world. Of course, it's important to take a very nuanced approach here, because we can't just blame Islamic scholarship as a whole, or all Ash'aris and Maturidi theologians, or just simply blame Al-Ghazali for the decline of science. There were many factors that went into this decline, such as external factors such as the Mongol invasions, colonialism, the stealing of resources from Muslim lands, invasions, disunity, and the like. And so we can't completely say that Islamic scholarship was to blame for this. However, it is true that the kind of vigor and the kind of thirst for knowledge, of all kinds of knowledge, not just religious knowledge but secular knowledge as well, was lost by the Muslims after certain events. And these sorts of this sort of vigor and thirst for knowledge that was lost by the Muslims ultimately led to their stagnation and decline. Again, it's very simple to point out these very basic historical patterns and trends that occurred within the Muslim world, and if we were to compare it with Western civilization, let's say, Western civilization went through the processes of rationalization, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Reformation, that allowed it, at least in the 18th and 19th centuries, to become a society that, despite being based quite heavily upon Christian and religious values, still fundamentally sought out science and still fundamentally sought out to learn all forms of knowledge of the world. And they allowed for some form of progressivism. For example, Max Weber pointed out how Calvinism led to the development of capitalism, whereas India and China, despite both being very much more advanced than Europe in the medieval world, never had the Industrial Revolution and never developed capitalism, at least in the way that the West did. That's because Confucianism had this worldly, non-aesthetic approach to the world, whilst the Indian tradition had an otherworldly aesthetic approach to the world. However, Calvinism combined an aesthetic plus this worldly approach that allowed its followers to constantly work hard and invest back into their businesses, which allowed for the development of capitalism. So it's safe to say that the Muslim world never went through something like these processes that occurred in the West to allow it to once again gain this vigor for learning and science and philosophy and rational thought. However, we must commend the Ash'ari and Maturidi traditions for keeping rational theology, philosophy, and logic alive in the Muslim world for as long as they did. These schools of thoughts have 1,000 or so years tradition of philosophy, logic, and rational thought, and hence these institutions kept alive philosophy within the Muslim world for thousands of so years, and for this we must give them credit.